Imagine for a moment that you could shed your sense of self, dissolve the boundaries between you and the universe, and experience a profound sense of interconnectedness with everything around you. This is the realm of ego death. A concept that has fascinated philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual seekers for centuries. Ego death is a journey into the depths of consciousness, a shedding of the illusion of separation, a glimpse into the true nature of reality. It's a concept that can be both terrifying and liberating, challenging our understanding of who we are and our place in the universe. In this video, we'll explore the many facets of ego death, from its psychological and philosophical underpinnings to its spiritual and mystical dimensions. We'll delve into the experiences of those who have ventured into this realm, and we'll examine the potential benefits and challenges of this profound transformation. But what exactly is ego death? It's a state where the boundaries of the self dissolve, where the I that we normally identify with fades away. Think of it like a drop of water merging back into the ocean, losing its individual form and becoming one with the vastness. The term ego death has roots in various fields. The philosopher William James called it self-surrender. Jungian psychology refers to it as psychic death, a fundamental transformation of the psyche. In mythology, it's a recurring theme, often symbolized by the hero's journey, a descent into the underworld, a confrontation with the shadow self, and a triumphant return, reborn. In the 1960s, the term gained popularity in the context of psychedelic experiences. Thinkers like Timothy Leary described the death of the ego as a key phase of an LSD trip, where the individual experiences a complete transcendence of the self, emerging with the universe. Today, the concept of ego death is also embraced in spiritual circles, particularly in New Age spirituality and Eastern religions like Buddhism. It's seen as a path to liberation, a way to break free from the illusion of separation and the suffering that arises from clinging to a limited sense of self. Eckhart Tolle, a prominent spiritual teacher, describes the ego as an accumulation of thoughts and emotions that we constantly identify with. This creates a sense of separation, a feeling of being a distinct entity apart from the rest of existence. Ego death, in this context, is about disidentifying from these thoughts and emotions, recognizing the true self that lies beyond the ego's limitations. So, how does one experience ego death? Well, there's various paths. Some people encounter it through intense meditation or spiritual practices. Others stumble upon it through profound life events like near-death experiences or intense psychological crises. And for some, psychedelic substances can act as a catalyst, offering a glimpse into this realm of consciousness. But regardless of the path, the experience of ego death is often described as transformative. It can lead to a profound sense of peace, interconnectedness, and liberation from the ego's constant chatter and demands. It can be a journey into the unknown, a shedding of old identities, and a glimpse into the true nature of reality. However, it's important to note that ego death can also be challenging. It can bring up deep-seated fears, anxieties, and a sense of disorientation as familiar reference points dissolve. It's a journey that requires courage, self-awareness, and a willingness to surrender to the unknown. The concept of ego death has been explored and defined in many ways. In the realm of mysticism, it's been described as an imageless experience, where personal identity dissolves completely. It's a state of pure awareness, beyond thoughts, perceptions, and even the sense of self. Sufi mystics called it fana, meaning annihilation, while Kabbalists refer to it as the kiss of death. Some spiritual teachers equate ego death with enlightenment, a state of complete liberation from the ego's grip. It's a renunciation of the self-centered perspective, a transcendence of the illusion of separation. The concept of ego death, as we understand it today, emerged from a fascinating convergence of ideas and influences. It comes from threads of romanticism, mysticism, psychology, anthropology, and even the countercultural movements of the 20th century. The Romantic movement, with its emphasis on individualism, emotion, and the sublime, laid the groundwork for exploring the depths of human experience, including the possibility of transcending the limitations of the ego. Theosophy also played a role. It emphasized the interconnectedness of all things and the potential for spiritual evolution, ideas that resonate with the concept of ego death. Anthropological research on rites of passage and shamanism shed light on the ways different cultures have used rituals and altered states of consciousness to facilitate transformative experiences, often involving a symbolic death and rebirth of the self. The psychedelic scene of the 1960s, with its exploration of altered states of consciousness and its questioning of societal norms, brought the concept of ego death into the mainstream. And finally, transpersonal psychology, with its focus on the spiritual dimensions of human experience, has further explored the potential of ego death for personal growth and transformation. The concept of ego death also has deep roots in Western mystical traditions. It echoes the experiences of Christian mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila, who described a profound union with the divine, a merging of the individual soul with God's consciousness. This idea of mystical union often involves a surrender of the ego, a letting go of the separate self to experience a deeper connection with the divine. This theme can be traced back through centuries of Western mystical thought. In the 13th century, Marguerite Peretti, a Christian mystic, wrote about the annihilation of the self and the pursuit of divine union. And even earlier, Sufi mystics in the Islamic tradition explore the concept of fana, which is the annihilation of the ego in the face of the divine. Jungian psychology offers a unique perspective on ego death, viewing it as a crucial stage in the process of individuation, the journey towards wholeness and self-realization. Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, referred to this process as psychic death, a fundamental transformation of the psyche that involves confronting and integrating the unconscious aspects of oneself. Jung believed that the ego, the conscious self, often operates in a limited and fragmented way, cut off from the deeper layers of the psyche. To achieve true wholeness, he argued, the ego must undergo a symbolic death, a surrender of its control, and a descent into the unconscious. This process can be challenging, often accompanied by intense emotions and a sense of disorientation, but it's also a necessary step towards integrating the shadow self, the hidden aspects of our personality that we often repress or deny. Jung used the analogy of alchemy to describe this process of transformation. Just as alchemists sought to transform base metals into gold, Jung believed that the psyche could be refined and purified through a process of confrontation and integration. He also drew parallels between psychic death and the experiences of Christian mystics like St. John of the Cross, who described a dark night of the soul, a period of intense spiritual struggle and purification. In Jungian psychology, ego death is not an end in itself, but rather a stage in the ongoing process of individuation. It's a shedding of old patterns and limitations, a descent into the depths of the psyche, and an emergence into a more integrated and authentic way of being. The concept of ego death also finds a powerful resonance in mythology, particularly in the archetypal hero's journey. Joseph Campbell, in his seminal work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, explored this universal pattern, found in myths and stories across cultures. The hero's journey typically begins with a call to adventure, a summons to leave the familiar world and embark on a perilous quest. The hero ventures into the unknown, facing trials and challenges that test their courage and resolve. And at the heart of this journey lies a symbolic death and rebirth. The hero must confront their deepest fears, their shadow self, the aspects of their personality they've repressed or denied. This confrontation often leads to a symbolic death, a shedding of the old identity, a surrender of the ego's control. This is the stage of ego death where the hero's sense of self dissolves and they experience a profound transformation. They may encounter supernatural forces, descend into the underworld, or face a symbolic dismemberment. But through this process of surrender and dissolution, they emerge reborn, stronger and wiser. Think of Dante's descent into the Inferno, or Odysseus' encounter with the Cyclops. These are classic examples of the hero's journey, where ego death plays a crucial role in the hero's transformation. The psychedelic movement in the 1960s played a significant role in bringing the concept of ego death to the forefront of Western culture. Inspired by figures like Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts, who drew parallels between psychedelic experiences and Eastern mystical traditions. A generation of seekers began exploring altered states of consciousness as a path to personal and spiritual growth. Timothy Leary, a controversial psychologist and advocate for psychedelic use, became a key figure in this movement. He saw LSD and other psychedelics as tools for expanding consciousness and breaking free from the limitations of the ego. He even co-authored a guide for LSD trips, The Psychedelic Experience, inspired by the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which framed the psychedelic journey as a symbolic death and rebirth. Leary and his colleagues believed that LSD could facilitate a stripping away of ego defenses, leading to a profound experience of ego death. They saw this as a necessary step towards spiritual rebirth, a shedding of the old self to make way for a new, more enlightened perspective. Other researchers, like Randolph Alnase, also explore the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, noting that they could lead to profound insights and personal transformations. Alnase described a three-stage process of ego death during an LSD experience. The loss of ego feeling. The individual experiences a dissolution of their sense of self, emerging with something larger than themselves. And then separation from the body. The individual may feel detached from their body, observing it from a distance, as if undergoing a symbolic death. And then rebirth. The individual returns to normal consciousness with a sense of relief, catharsis, and often profound insights into themselves and the world. Timothy Leary offered a detailed description of ego death. He outlined 3 stages in his process, mirroring the 3 bardos described in Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Chikai Bardo, the ego-free state. This first stage is characterized by complete transcendence of the self and the game of everyday life. It's a state of pure awareness, where the ego dissolves and the individual experiences a profound sense of unity with the universe. Leary describes it as a state where all things are like the void and cloudless sky, and the intellect is like a transparent vacuum. In the psychedelic experience, Leary provides instructions for navigating the stage, encouraging the voyager to embrace this temporary death of the ego and use it as an opportunity to attain enlightenment. Chanyad Bardo, the period of hallucinations. This second stage is characterized by vivid hallucinations and intense emotions. The individual may experience a kaleidoscope of visions, encounter archetypal figures, or relive past memories. This stage can be both exhilarating and challenging, as the individual navigates a realm of heightened sensory input and emotional intensity. Sidpa Bardo, the return to routine reality. This final stage involves a gradual return to ordinary consciousness and the reintegration of the ego. The individual may carry with them insights and perspectives gained during the ego death experience, but they also face the challenge of integrating these experiences into their everyday life. Stanislav Grof, a renowned psychiatrist and researcher, has made significant contributions to our understanding of ego death, particularly in the context of psychedelic experiences. Through his extensive work with psychedelics and other non-pharmacological methods for exploring consciousness, Grof has developed a detailed cartography of the psyche, mapping the different levels and dimensions of human experience. Groff argues that traditional psychological models, which focus primarily on the individual's biography and conscious mind, are inadequate for understanding the profound experiences that can arise from psychedelic use or other intense practices. He proposes a broader model that includes deep unconscious and superconscious levels of the human psyche, realms that are often accessed during altered states of consciousness. Groff's models include several key levels: the sensory barrier and the recollective biographical barrier. These barriers represent the limitations of ordinary consciousness, restricting our access to deeper levels of the psyche. The perinatal matrices. These matrices are associated with the experiences of birth, encompassing the different stages of labor and delivery. Groff believes that these early experiences can have a profound impact on our psychological development and can be re-experienced during altered states of consciousness. And the transpersonal dimensions. These dimensions encompass experiences that transcend the individual ego and connect us to a larger reality, including archetypal realms, past lives, and collective consciousness. Groff places ego death within the fourth perinatal matrix, associated with the actual birth of the child. He describes it as a death-rebirth experience, where the individual may feel a sense of total annihilation, a destruction of all previous reference points. However, Groff sees this ego death not as a literal end of the self, but rather as a shedding of a paranoid attitude towards the world that often stems from the trauma of birth. It's a liberation from the limitations of the skin-encapsulated ego, a chance to connect with a deeper sense of self and a more expansive reality. Recent research continues to shed light on the fascinating phenomenon of ego death, particularly in the context of psychedelic experiences. Studies have shown that psychedelic drugs like LSD, psilocybin, and DMT can reliably induce states of ego dissolution, allowing researchers to study this phenomenon in a controlled setting. To measure these experiences, scientists have developed tools like the Ego Dissolution Inventory, a questionnaire that allows individuals to report on their subjective experiences of ego loss. This inventory helps researchers quantify the different aspects of ego death, such as the loss of self-boundaries, the sense of unity with the universe, and the dissolution of the sense of time and space. This research is providing valuable insights into the psychological and neurological mechanisms underlying ego death. It's helping us understand how psychedelics affect the brain, leading to these profound alterations in consciousness. And it's also revealing the potential therapeutic benefits of ego death, particularly in the treatment of conditions like depression, anxiety, and addiction. Buddhism offers a rich and nuanced perspective on ego death, viewing it as a central aspect of the path to enlightenment. In Zen practice, for example, the dissolution of the ego is seen as a crucial step towards realizing one's true nature. This great death, as it's sometimes called, contrasts with the physical small death and represents a profound shift in consciousness. Buddhist teachings emphasize that the ego, or sense of self, is not a fixed entity, but rather a fluid and impermanent process. Clinging to the sense of self leads to suffering and attachment, while letting go of it opens the door to liberation. Meditation, in the Buddhist context, can be seen as a practice of dying to the ego, of learning to forget the sense of self. As the practitioner deepens their meditation, the usual chatter of the mind quiets down, and the sense of a separate self begins to dissolve. This can lead to a profound experience of emptiness, a realization that the I is not a solid entity, but rather a collection of fleeting thoughts, sensations, and perceptions. This experience of egolessness can be both liberating and unsettling. It can bring up existential anxiety as the familiar ground of the self seems to disappear, but it also opens the door to a deeper understanding of reality, a recognition of the interconnectedness of all things. It's important to distinguish between egolessness and the Buddhist concept of anatta, or non-self. While egolessness is a personal experience, anatta is a fundamental doctrine that describes the impermanent and interconnected nature of all phenomenon. It teaches us that there is no permanent, unchanging self or essence within any being or thing. Taoism, an ancient Chinese philosophy, offers a unique perspective on ego death, emphasizing the importance of harmonizing with the Tao, the natural flow of the universe. While Taoism doesn't explicitly use the term ego death, it speaks to the idea of transcending the limitations of the ego and merging with the greater whole. Bruce Francis, a renowned Taoist teacher and internal martial artist, shares a personal experience that sheds light on the Taoist perspective on ego death. He describes a moment of intense fear and disorientation during the late-night Tai Chi practice, where he felt as if his sense of self was dissolving into the vastness of the universe. Francis called this experience Ru Ding, a fear of ego annihilation. He explains that the ego, accustomed to its sense of separation and control, can react with terror when confronted with the reality of interconnectedness. The ego, he says, spews forth all sorts of terrifying psychological and physiological reactions in an attempt to cling to its illusion of separateness. This experience highlights the challenges that can arise on the path to ego death. The ego, threatened with dissolution, can resist with all its might, creating fear, anxiety, and even physical discomfort. However, from a Taoist perspective, this resistance is ultimately futile. The Tao cannot be resisted. True harmony and peace come from aligning oneself with the Tao, letting go of the ego's grip, and embracing the interconnectedness of all things. Contemporary spiritual teacher Bernadette Roberts offers a nuanced perspective on ego death, distinguishing between no ego and no self. She argues that the dissolution of the ego is not the ultimate goal, but rather a stepping stone towards a deeper realization of the true self. Roberts defines the ego as the immature self, centered on its own desires and perceptions. It's the part of us that constantly seeks validation, craves pleasure, and avoids pain. The falling away of the ego, she suggests, is a necessary step towards spiritual growth, but it's not the final destination. Beyond the ego lies the self, which Roberts defines as the totality of consciousness, encompassing both the conscious and unconscious aspects of our being. It's the deeper, more expansive self of who we are, connected to the divine or the universal consciousness. However, even this sense of self, Robert argues, must eventually dissolve to realize the ultimate truth. This is the state of no self, a complete transcendence of all identification, a merging with the ground of being itself. Robert draws parallels between this process and the experiences of the Buddha and Jesus Christ. The Buddha's ascetic practices and Jesus' crucifixion represent the falling away of the ego, the surrender of the limited self. Their subsequent enlightenment and resurrection, respectively, symbolize the realization of no self, a state of complete unity with the divine. The experience of ego death, whether through psychedelics, meditation, or other means, can be profoundly transformative, but it also raises the question, what happens after the ego dissolves? How do individuals integrate this experience back into their everyday lives? Nick Brommel, a scholar who has written extensively about psychedelic experiences, suggests that ego death can be both frightening and liberating. It challenges our fundamental sense of self, forcing us to confront the impermanence and interconnectedness of all things. But this confrontation can also lead to a deeper acceptance of reality, a reconciliation with the insight that there is no solid, unchanging self. Groff, in his research notes on psychedelics, notes that the experience of ego death can be particularly intense during the initial sessions. Individuals may experience panic and fear as their sense of self dissolves. However, with repeated exposure and a conscious effort to embrace the experience, this fear can gradually subside. Eventually, the individual may even develop a sense of equanimity towards the idea of death, recognizing it as a natural part of the cycle of life. This process of integration can take time and effort. It requires a willingness to confront uncomfortable emotions, to question old beliefs, and to embrace a new way of seeing the world. But for many, the rewards are well worth the effort. Integrating the ego death experience can lead to greater self-awareness, compassion, and a deeper connection with the universe. It's important to note that integration is not always easy. Individuals who have undergone ego death may struggle to reconcile their experience with the demands of everyday life. They may feel alienated from their old selves, disconnected from their previous values and goals. Seeking support from therapists, spiritual guides, or communities of like-minded individuals can be crucial during this process. The wisdom traditions of Vedanta and Zen Buddhism offer valuable insights into the process of integrating ego death and cultivating a truly liberating way of being. Both traditions emphasize that a mere glimpse of the emptiness of self or an enlightenment experience is not enough. True transformation requires ongoing practice and dedication. In Advaita Vedanta, a non-dualistic school of Hindu philosophy, the ultimate goal is to realize the identity of the individual's self, Atman, with the universal consciousness, Brahman. This involves recognizing the illusory nature of the ego and its attachments. However, this realization is not a one-time event, but rather a gradual process of purification and refinement. As spiritual teacher Bonnie Greenwell explains, years of committed practice are often necessary to dismantle the deeply ingrained patterns and conditioning that keep us bound to the ego. These patterns, known as vasanas and samskaras, are like deep grooves in the mind, shaping our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Zen Buddhism, likewise, emphasizes the importance of ongoing practice, even after experiencing kensho, a sudden insight into one's true nature. This insight, while profound, is just the beginning of the journey. Deepening this insight and expressing it in daily life requires continued dedication and effort. Zen master Hakyuin Ikaku stressed the importance of post-satori practice, which involves cultivating the mind of enlightenment. This involves integrating the insights gained through meditation into every aspect of life, transforming one's thoughts, speech, and actions. Zen teacher Yamada Kaun succinctly captures the essence of this integration. If you cannot weep with the person who is crying, there is no kensho. True enlightenment, he suggests, is not an intellectual understanding, but a lived experience of compassion and interconnectedness. The journey towards ego death and the integration of such experiences can sometimes lead to challenging and even distressing periods. Shinzen Young, a prominent American Buddhist teacher, highlights this aspect by drawing attention to what he calls the dark night, a state that can arise after experiencing the emptiness of self. Young describes the dark night as falling into the pit of the void. It's a state where the individual has a genuine insight into the nature of emptiness and non-self. But instead of feeling empowered and liberated, they experience it as a terrifying and destabilizing bad trip. This highlights the potential difficulties of integrating ego death experiences. This dissolution of the ego, while ultimately liberating, can also be disorienting and anxiety-provoking. Familiar reference points dissolve, the sense of self becomes unstable, and the individual may feel lost and adrift in a world that no longer makes sense. Willoughby Britton, a clinical psychologist and meditation researcher, is conducting groundbreaking research on these challenging aspects of spiritual practice. Her Dark Night of the Soul project explores the difficult periods that can arise during meditation and other spiritual practices. She draws on texts from various traditions and conducts interviews with practitioners to understand the full spectrum of experiences, including the challenging ones. Britton's research sheds light on the importance of providing support and guidance for those navigating the complexities of ego death and spiritual awakening. It highlights the need for integrating these experiences in a healthy and balanced way, recognizing that the journey can be challenging and may require professional support or guidance from experienced practitioners. The propagation of LSD-induced mystical experiences and the concept of ego death certainly made waves in the 1960s, influencing countercultural movements, art, music, and even some aspects of mainstream society. While Timothy Leary and others championed the transformative potential of psychedelics, their vision of an LSD-fueled spiritual revolution didn't fully materialize. The reasons for this are complex. The association of LSD with the counterculture, the media's sensationalized portrayal of its effects, and the government's crackdown on psychedelic use all contributed to a growing stigma around these substances. Furthermore, the intense and often challenging nature of ego death experiences made them difficult to integrate into mainstream society. The idea of dissolving the ego, while appealing to some, was also unsettling and even threatening to many others. Despite these challenges, the influence of the psychedelic movement and the concept of ego death can still be felt today. The exploration of consciousness, the questioning of societal norms, and the search for deeper meaning and connection continue to resonate with many individuals. And with the resurgence of psychedelic research in recent years, there's a renewed interest in the potential therapeutic benefits of these substances, particularly in the treatment of mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, and PTSD. The influence of psychedelic experiences and the concept of ego death even reached the iconic band, the Beatles, particularly John Lennon. He was deeply fascinated by Timothy Leary's work, and reportedly read the psychedelic experience multiple times, using it as a guide for his own LSD trips. Lennon's exploration of psychedelics is evident in the Beatles' music, mostly in songs like Tomorrow Never Knows, which is infused with mystical imagery and themes of transcending the self. The song's swirling soundscapes and introspective lyrics reflect Lennon's fascination with altered states of consciousness and the dissolution of the ego. However, Lennon's experiences with LSD was not without its challenges. He reportedly took the drug over 1,000 times, but eventually concluded that it exasperated his personal difficulties rather than providing lasting solutions. Likewise, George Harrison and Paul McCartney, while also experimenting with LSD, ultimately found that it didn't lead to the profound and lasting changes that they had hoped for. The concept of ego death, particularly as experienced through psychedelics, has been linked to the idea of radical pluralism, a philosophical perspective that challenges the notion of a fixed and stable reality. Nick Brommel, in his exploration of psychedelic culture, suggests that ego death can confirm this radical pluralism, revealing a world of multiple perspectives and fluid realities. Brommel argues that many people, particularly in their youth, have glimpses of this radical pluralism, a sense that reality is not as fixed and objective as it seems. However, this can be a destabilizing experience, leading many to cling to the comfort of a stable self in a predictable world. Psychedelic experiences, Brommel suggests, can shatter these illusions, revealing the fluidity and interconnectedness of all things. The dissolution of the ego can open the door to a world of multiple perspectives, where reality is not a fixed entity, but rather a dynamic and ever-changing process. This embrace of radical pluralism, Brommel argues, was a key factor in the countercultural movements of the 1960s. Young people, inspired by psychedelic experiences and Eastern philosophies, began to question the rigid structures and beliefs of their parents' generation. They saw the pursuit of material success and conformity as a form of self-deception, a denial of the deeper truths revealed through ego death. This rejection of the status quo led to a wave of social and political activism, as young people sought to create a more authentic and meaningful way of life. They embraced diversity, challenged authority, and explored new forms of expression and community. While the radical pluralism of the 1960s may have faded somewhat, its influence can still be felt today. The questioning of societal norms, the embrace of diversity, and a search for deeper meaning and connection continue to inspire individuals and movements around the world. The association of ego death with LSD and the psychedelic movement has been a source of controversy and debate. Some critics, like Hunter S. Thompson, have pointed to a perceived self-centeredness in Timothy Leary's work, arguing that his focus on the individual ego undermines the very concept of ego death. Others have raised concerns about the potential for negative experiences with psychedelics, noting that not all LSD trips lead to blissful states of unity. Bad trips, characterized by anxiety, paranoia, and even psychosis, can be deeply unsettling and even traumatizing for some individuals. The notion that LSD can provide a shortcut to enlightenment has also been met with skepticism, particularly from within traditional spiritual communities. Brad Warner, a Soto Zen teacher, has been a vocal critic of this idea, arguing that psychedelics, while potentially offering glimpses of altered states, cannot replace the dedicated practice and discipline required for genuine spiritual development. He points to the tragic fates of some iconic figures in music and culture who struggled with psychedelic use, suggesting that these substances can be destabilizing and even destructive when not approached with caution and respect. The idea that ego death, or a similar experience, might be the common basis for all religions has also been challenged by scholars. They argue that religious experiences are diverse and complex, shaped by cultural, historical, and individual factors, and cannot be reduced to a single phenomenon. Furthermore, the attempt to link ego death and psychedelics with Tibetan Buddhism has been criticized for misinterpreting and misrepresenting the nuances of this ancient tradition. Scholars like John Reynolds have pointed out that the popular understanding of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, particularly as presented by Leary and Young, is often inaccurate and misleading. So there you have it, ego death, a terrifying, liberating, and utterly transformative experience. A journey into the abyss where the boundaries of self dissolve and you confront the raw, unfiltered reality of existence. Whether it's a terrifying plunge into the void or a blissful merging with the universe, ego death is a powerful reminder of the fragility of our sense of self and the interconnectedness of all things. Thank you everyone for watching. My name's The Big Y. Don't forget to drop a like, and if you're new to the Why Not family, a follow. And I'll catch you guys in the next video.